Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review The Crow, City of Angels. Ultimately, this is the second installment of the Crow-esque like series because there have been a number of variations of said movie. At the end of the day, there have been, of course, more notably, the very first original Crow, which of course had Ernie Hudson in it, and ultimately is more notably known for accidentally uh, killing one of its own crows and or cast members, sadly enough. We also have it to where we've had sequels among the Crow City of Angels, which is the second iteration. We've also had the Crow Salvation and then the Crow Wicked Prayer, which ultimately is kind of the more like irrelevant Crow movies because when looking at it, we have like David Boreanaz as the villain in this movie. Tara Reid is the kind of female quasi love interest. We have Tito Ortiz being in a movie for reasons that you don't really quite understand because ultimately no offense to Tito, but when I'm going into a movie, I'm not going into a movie because Tito Ortiz is in it, sadly enough. But when looking at it, it is what it is. I'm sure he was just happy about being in a Crow movie, but didn't realize it was going to be that one. So, at the end of the day, let's go out of our way, to go into talking about this movie. If anything, this, of course, feels like this movie was shot overseas. Of course, the casted Crow, ultimately Ash, within this thing because they're going through a whole different iteration and whole different approach to this. Uh, we also have Thai Tran, who ultimately we notably note the fact that ultimately she had died in her career way too soon, and normally a lot of people would throw that out there for people to reflect on. The girl that ends up playing Callie in this movie, more notably, she had played Trini in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers series. Ultimately, a lot of people know how well and beloved that this character is, even though when looking at it sadly, like she doesn't have very much to her credit of many roles to do. So going into this, we have like I think the very after this very much first Crow movie with Ernie Hudson and Eric Draven, I think really the only bad point of a Crow movie is it starts to easily and quickly become like a very paint by numbers kind of movie when looking at it. It's just like, okay, well, the entire movie is to very much set up who's going to be in the beginning of this film, who's going to be in this movie for the rest of the film. Because basically, you will have some characters that, of course, are very much kind of bashed through more than others. To easily just go, oh yeah, I'm easily going to kill you, pop. I'm easily going to kill you, pop. And so on and so forth. When going into this, reasonably, it seems like they were trying for a much more seemingly lighter approach. It doesn't really seem like you can see the Crow Ash really actually killing people in this movie. It just seems like a lot of this movie is them ending up like just seeing them dead later on. Or you kind of eventually have to just assume that they died via some means of which to have them be killed. So going into this, it's a very interesting movie. I really wanted to review it for a couple of reasons. One, ultimately, it has, of course, the Day of the Dead in it, which ultimately we are coming up on October or at the end of October. So I kind of wanted to kind of slide this one in because ultimately knowing full well that this movie actually talks about Halloween. Also, reasonably within me, I really like how dark and gritty this movie is. I know a lot of people could easily bash this movie for how very much paint by numbers it is and maybe how irrelevant it is. I actually really love the dialogue in this movie. I think that this movie has very complicated dialogue, which makes for a very interesting movie. And for a lot of people that probably don't know, there's some times where I would quote this. I don't think I've done it in any of these kinds of videos, but every once in a while, I will reflect on the quote, "Pain is my power," and so reasonably, "Pain is my power" is of course a very interesting quote, in which a quote of which I got from here. So at the end of the day, it's a very interesting movie, and like I said, after the very first Crow, like all the other Crow movies start to become like a very paint by numbers like approach, where it's like, okay, you set all this up in the very beginning to knock it down the rest of the film. And reasonably, a lot of the kills are maybe too simple for a lot of people. Maybe a lot of the revenge kills. I mean, going into this, I really like the dialogue. At some points, there are interesting choices in music. You have a metal cover of the old fashioned song Boogeyman, which ultimately is showcased with Ash coming out of the building on fire, and ultimately having that Boogeyman song placed was really fun to me. Because knowing full well how the Crow movies, if anything, have a really interesting soundtrack, especially after the first movie. Because I think a lot of the first film maybe has too much of a generic feel and ultimately doesn't really care about music all that well, or has to kind of play the same notes kind of over and over. Going into this movie, we the only thing that I think has a negative side to it is I really and truly don't believe that Ash wouldn't be able to overpower these people in the very early of this movie, to where ultimately I cannot truly believe that Ash wouldn't overpower all three to four of these people to run away, to get away, to not have it end up where him and his son ending up earlier on in this movie. And they try to very much try to reinvent the wheel at some points in these Crow movies. Normally noted that usually these Crow movies have something to do with a crow and then a other individual, which that is their driving force, their revenge, their way of wanting to seek out vengeance. Knowing full well, it seems that at some point there is probably going to be another Crow movie somewhere down the pipeline. It seems that there is an illusion that eventually at some point they are going to eventually do a maybe possible Jason Momoa Crow movie, or the Crow movie. Maybe they're going to just call it Crow finally instead of the Crow. Because I don't think it really matters. I think ultimately when looking at it, like if you just called it Crow, or maybe I don't know. So going going into this too, like the movie kind of does become paint by numbers, and once you get more iterations of the Crow movies, it kind of feels like they realized like how to take down the Crow, and then every single movie goes that exact same pattern. Like when looking at like the Crow and the Crow's Salvation, basically almost feels copy and paste of the same movie. The only thing is that instead of it being thugs or gangsters or whatever in the Crow's Salvation, it ends up being cops instead, like dirty cops. And ultimately, the cast in that is just kind of. But anyways, I thought that it was a very interesting The Crow movie. Ultimately, if anybody wants me to go out of my way to review any of the other Crow movies, because more than likely, probably anybody just reviewed the original Crow, and that's it, because probably a lot of people would say, yeah, all the Crows after that are irrelevant, or all the Crows after that are just garbage. That's completely okay to understand that ultimately, reasonably, yeah, these movies don't hold up. But I think I liked this one just because it was visually much more wildly different than the first movie, and then also it just kind of is darker, grittier, and much interesting. I truly believe visually than anything else. So I think that's all I wanted to say for a very cryptic like version. I think now that we're gonna go into spoiler territory, so at the end of the day, where can you go to see this movie? Well, when looking at it, I really reasonably couldn't figure out a real meaningful way for you to say to be able to watch this. More than likely, it's probably on a Vudu or an Amazon somewhere. More than likely for some probably rental fee of sorts. More than likely, I would probably assume that The Crow probably has a collection at this point for you to just buy, like all four of the movies within a pretty decent price. Because ultimately, like The Crow is not something that is really something hugely viable. That is going to be like an expensive means of which to go and find and see. But ultimately, you can probably go through any bootleggish like means to eventually see any number of these Crow movies. You can probably go into a movie pro or a just kind of movie box or something of that variety and eventually go into a movie app that is basically 100% free to ultimately see a Crow movie. Going into this, I probably approached an app called Movie Pro because it seems like they have every single one of these movies that eventually you can see at some point. So, ultimately, if you've never seen any of the Crows past the first one, like, I honestly think that Salvation is a very actually interesting movie. It seems that this movie really does. Like, the only thing that I harper back about this movie is, like, within the very first film and I think, The Crow's Salvation, it kind of bleeds to the fact that it seems that the people who had killed someone to have the Crow being a very vengeance like person, ultimately, usually it starts to eventually bleed into within these sequels or that ultimately there seems to be more than just the people that were otherwise tied to the original killing. It seems like there was people that had very much were very much people to tell people what to do, to tell people to take these people out, and then eventually the Crow seeks vengeance on them. Where in this movie it comes to be very much more simpler. Uh, there isn't a much more like, okay, this is a guy behind the scenes that ultimately had some information on this case and did bupkis with it and just sat on it and this and that. So that's ultimately I want to say about these Crow movies. Salvation is probably pretty interesting, but at the end of the day, people might say it's irrelevant. I thought that the Crow Salvation again has another really interesting soundtrack. I really enjoyed it for that, and interestingly enough, yeah, it was just very interesting music. So let's go into the spoilers about the Crow Salvation, the Crow City of Angels. So let's go into busting out that double five to otherwise talk about the Crow City of Angels. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So the Crow City of Angels. Again, if you could kind of easily tell exactly how this movie kind of approaches itself. So, reasonably, what ends up starting this all off is reasonably we have a character named Sarah who is ultimately a tattoo artist that is ultimately working at a shop with Noah. And Sarah is ultimately having a seemingly a ton of visions. It seems like she is a person who can see things, ultimately bleeding into Judah's second-hand woman that ultimately can seemingly see things as well, see into Judah's future. Who ultimately Judah is Ash's arch nemesis in this movie. He's the guy that basically tells people who lives and who dies. So ultimately, when going into this movie, we have it to where Sarah is ultimately she is having nightmares. She can't sleep properly, and so ultimately she goes into the tattoo parlor, and Noah is just realizing how like disheveled Sarah is, and ultimately she's like, "Well, I haven't been sleeping lately. Like I've been having these weird dreams." Because at first Noah asks, "Is like, well, hey, who's the guy's name?" And she's like, "No, it's not a guy. It's just I've been having horrible dreams." Flashing us to the point of consistently seeing that Sarah is actually dreaming and or having these flashbacks about Ash, ultimately knowing full well that Ash has a son that ultimately is a painter, which I think this movie is probably the best way to help us understand, or the best way to help us really kind of gravitate to the fact of, okay, why does the crow wear makeup? It didn't make sense in the first movie to me, but in this movie it actually makes much more sense. I would love it if within these crow movies they would easily help you understand how he gets the makeup on. And on a side note, I'd also completely forgot about The Crow, the series. There has been a whole entire season of the show The Crow. So ultimately, you can also check that out as well. I actually really enjoy that show. I watched quite a bulk of the episodes. I have a whole entire uh, complete series disc of those. I gotta finish watching up that series. Maybe at some point I'll probably review it. Maybe depending on how relevant or irrelevant The Crow is. So we have it to where Ash, excuse me, we have it to where Ash is seemingly an engine head. It seems that he's working on his bike, or ultimately just working on other people's bikes. And while he's doing that, because ultimately it doesn't seem like this crow is a musician of sorts, it seems that we see Ash's son ultimately be painting. And recently it seems that Ash's son doesn't have like a huge variety of paints. And so ultimately Ash is looking at his photo and he's like, "Hey, what's that?" And Ash's son ultimately says that it's them two together. And ultimately Ash is like, "Well, what's on the top there?" And Ash's son says a blue sun. And Ash says a blue sun. That's kind of interesting. So we ultimately have it to be heard that Ash's son seemingly assumes that there are fireworks being shot out. That's what I would assume. Hence, the only reason why to justify to me why this kid would easily and quickly run out, thinking that there might have been fireworks being shot out somewhere. I'm assuming that Ash and his son, all of this stuff was taken place probably a year before. And so when these people come back, it probably maybe justifies much more sense to where like people remember Ash, but it's not like a very like quick thing right away at some portions in time. So we ultimately have it to where Ash's son runs out to see what this noise was. I would assume again that there are probably fireworks going off or to entice the son, and so ultimately we have Ash's son who is running out, and Ash fully knows what that sound is, and it's gunfire. So knowing full well that his son should actually be fully aware that this is not exactly a safe place. It's not a safe neighborhood. Like it ultimately it doesn't really seem like that like at first, because I think that Ash's son is way too curious. So going into this movie, we have to our Ash and Ash's son go out to see what all the commotion is, and it ends up being that we have Curve and Callie, Spider Monkey, and Nemo all going to kill one person. Ultimately, Ash and Ash's son end up witnessing said murder, and so eventually that leads them to reasonably, of course, being a witness to something. They end up, of course, being killed because Judah ultimately commands it to be so. Because ultimately, Judah really doesn't care about loss of life. Ultimately, he mass kills a bunch of people with his own drug, ultimately giving it a very much bad batch, which ultimately someone confronts him about it being a bad batch of drugs, and Judah does not care. He doesn't flinch. He's just like, well, I guess it was a bad batch. Because ultimately he fills this guy's arm with drugs to ultimately kill him off, because he was the only one that went up against Judah to tell him that it was a bad batch of drugs. Ultimately, we have it to where Curve, Callie, Nemo, and Spider Monkey are surrounding Ash and his son. Ultimately, Ash the entire time is holding on to his son, kind of begging and demanding that they let his son go, if anything, because ultimately he supposedly didn't really see anything, or that ultimately he won't tell anybody anything. And the entire time you have these characters swarm around Ash, and each one of them are all telling him certain seemingly catchphrases that will held them on to being replayed to them as if a parrot or a crow for the rest of this film. Ultimately, we have Curve telling Ash that he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. We have Nemo ultimately, of course, more notably the actor that plays the Punisher movie, ultimately yelling out lights, camera, action, because this guy loves to seemingly tape everything. Callie very much is a nursery rhyme esh like person that says, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry." And Spider Monkey, reasonably, a bulk of his lines are just kind of like super generic. To the point of which you can barely even remember what the lines actually are. Um, Ultimately, to where it's like no one's gonna save you or no one's gonna help you kind of thing, or like you're on your own kind of thing. It's something along those lines. I don't remember what Spider Monkey's one liner is, because ultimately you'll find out later that this character doesn't really quite seem all that relevant, to be brutally honest. And of course, Judah basically rolls us up with pain is his power, and then ultimately, basically, he gives the Curve a go ahead to give the big old thumbs down, ultimately letting him know that he's completely fine with wasting Ash and his son. So basically, what we have it to do is that these people ultimately shot this man, and so ultimately, guess what happens? They end up shooting both Ash and his son and ultimately dumping them into the river. To ultimately, when Sarah is again relaying in her head, because she consistently daydreams about Ash and his son being killed, ultimately Ash reemerges from the water to ultimately seek vengeance, ultimately untying himself and then eventually coming back for vengeance. Also going back into the water to retrieve his son at some point and ultimately giving him the proper burial. So, going into this movie, we have it to where it seems that Sarah and Ash has a much more like heavy connection to the point where Sarah ultimately retrieves Ash from the waters to ultimately clean him up and put paint upon his face. Ultimately, the paints are from Ash's son, ultimately, like helping us understand where exactly we finally do have a real reason for these paints. So, going into this movie, we push to now have it to where Ash wants to seek vengeance and reasonably he doesn't know where to go exactly. He kind of goes for the easiest person, which is, of course, first, Spider Monkey. Ultimately, Spider Monkey is very much a druggy like character, so he is, of course, met up within him producing all the drugs. So we have it to where Ash ultimately goes and reintroduces himself to Spider Monkey, telling him that he's all his nightmares all rolled into one. And so ultimately, we have it to where Spider Monkey is running around through all these barrels, running through this maze to ultimately try to evade the crow. And reasonably, we have it to where the crow is just looking at Spider Monkey for information, but also to seek vengeance. Because ultimately, the crow doesn't know like who actually had really and truly attacked him and his son. Ultimately, I guess it's lucky enough that Spider Monkey and or any number of these people could recognize Ash, because then ultimately Spider Monkey would know who had all killed him and his son. Because ultimately there have been some iterations where ultimately no one could recognize who the crow is, and that would make it so much more harder for a villain to want to get and interrogate somebody to ultimately get information. So the crow ultimately grabs onto Spider Monkey and asks who had all killed his son and himself. And so Spider Monkey eventually mentions Curve, mentions Callie, Nemo, and ultimately Judah. So ultimately, knowing full well that, of course, we're going to save Judah for last because there's a whole reason for that. So, reasonably, we have it to where we have the crow, of course, since giving this information, gives Spider Monkey a much more fighting chance. So ultimately, we have it to where, like, it's kind of like the Two-Face from the Dark Knight scenario, where we have it to where ultimately the crow gives this man fighting chance. He randomly picks a card, and so we have it to where Spider Monkey throws up the card, and of course, Crow has a queen, and he ultimately says Lady Luck is a bitch. And then eventually, drags Spider Monkey to eventually just get blown up within his factory. Again, as the Crow is walking out, he is of course walking out to a metal Ash-like cover of Boogeyman, which of course is really interesting to me. We find that every time that the Crow ends up killing someone, he ends up leaving a Crow signia. Within this very first iteration, we have it to where the Crow is leaving a Crow symbol in flames. So ultimately, we have it to where within this movie, it's just kind of moving from person to person to person, and within consistent times, we have it to where Ash is very much a kind of a different Ash like Crow. It seems that he is holding stuff too strongly to the point where there are numerous times where he is just like kind of like bashing his head against a wall, kind of metaphorically and literally talking, to where he's like grabbing things and chucking them around, and like this very angry and upset person. And I always try to I always want, when I look in this, I'm like, why is why is he so upset? Because when looking at it, knowing full well he is in the midst of one of the people that ultimately had done his son wrong. So ultimately, when looking at it, shouldn't he be much more happier to see these people, knowing full well that he is slowly but surely going to murder every single one of them? So, making our way to Nemo, ultimately having Nemo being very much a person that has very small like means, ultimately going to a live girls theatrical room of sorts, very much adult content-ish. So ultimately, we have it to where Nemo is buying tokens to ultimately see a woman for a long period of time, because we have it to where ultimately Nemo is going into a room that ultimately, when token is presented, a woman is showcased, seemingly scantily clad or otherwise, there to entice a man for some adult content. So Nemo goes into this room, ultimately gets a token, plops it in, ultimately telling the girl that we're gonna get Christmas a little bit early this year. And so ultimately we have this kind of adult content like moment, and then eventually the woman has to let him know, it's like, hey, make sure you're ready for those tokens, because ultimately that's all that really matters to her. So because ultimately he's asking for some sugar, and then he's mentioning that Christmas is going to be early this year. So we eventually have the wall drop, and ultimately, frustratingly, getting Nemo to want to plop in more tokens. And so once the token, or once the wall reemerges, we have it to where Crow is ultimately appearing there instead of the woman, um, ultimately having a very abrasive or interesting approach to like his kind of like funny Esh like saying, where ultimately he says like did you miss me, daddy, or something like that, like something along those approaches. And so eventually we have Crow smashing through this glass window, ultimately to very much attack Nemo. Very much we have like Nemo being thrusted through seemingly tons and tons of glass, having him being dragged throughout this very like glassy like environment, but then eventually where the Crow is seemingly getting almost a quasi going to be seemingly attacked within this live show Ash like place, ultimately he wants nothing of it. He just wants Nemo, and that's it. So we have it to where the crow is smashing Nemo through numerous amounts of like glassy cabinets or this and that to ultimately seek vengeance upon Nemo, ultimately consistently like randomly having seemingly this random esh like number of crows where ultimately he like mentions like 6 crows, silver, and 7 crows. Uh, the truth is never to be told, or like all these random esh like sayings, like 8 crows, and so on and so forth. Like this bizarrish crow countdown that we've never heard of in our lives. So we have it to where ultimately the crow ends up taking Nemo off camera and putting him back into the room that he had originally been in. But this time around, he is eyeless and he very much is seemingly scarred and scarred up completely. Because ultimately, we have it to where Curve and Callie both go there to ultimately find Nemo into this room, and ultimately Curve eventually notices that there is something protruding out of Nemo's mouth, and he pulls it out, and surefire enough, uh, it's a crow origami. So ultimately telling us that again, crow symbol seemingly in every single where of which. So push us to have Curve really starting to notice that there's a pattern emerging, that eventually it seems that people are coming for him, and ultimately because we find out even before this that Judah's seemingly like fortune teller esh like woman is telling Judah that he's going to die soon, and ultimately by every single one of his mistakes coming back on him full fold. So ultimately we have it to where Curve is panicking and ultimately realizing it seems that everyone is left for dead, or getting killed of this group. And so ultimately the fortune esh like teller is telling Curve that he has been marked. He has been marked by a tattoo of his own design that ultimately, when looking back on it, it actually looks like a bird, a crow. And Curve doesn't realize it until it's too late. So ultimately, Curve goes to the tattoo artist, who, of course, is coincidentally Sarah, and ultimately wants her to change the tattoo because ultimately she effed it up. And ultimately he threatens her because ultimately it's like, well, hey, like I have a bird on my chest, and she's like, well, yeah, that's the design that you wanted. And so ultimately Curve pulls a gun on Sarah, and ultimately Noah tries to get into the lurch to try to protect them, or protect Sarah, because ultimately knowing full well Noah had tried to um, give Sarah some Day of the Dead candy, and ultimately it was kind of like a fortune cookie like thing where ultimately Sarah um, read off some little thing that she thought was like a little funny ditty. So we have it to where Curve pulling a gun on Sarah and Noah, ultimately Curve is looking at Noah and ultimately mentioning how like he is pissing his pants that he's so ready to die, which I thought was kind of a hilarious line. Like Curve is for all of his like weird esh like things in this movie, some of the stuff that he says is kind of interesting or is kind of funny, and it feels like a very memorable role. Ultimately, calling some people sugar plum, or ultimately having these like vicious Ash like things really coming out whenever he is very much wanting information. So ultimately, we come to later having it to be that, uh, or ultimately, we have it to where Sarah ends up hitting Curve in the nuts, and eventually he ends up backing away. All while, of course, giving a very vulgar um, Esh like outing, and then eventually he breaks a glass Esh like thing in there and then leaves. We eventually have them come back, Curve and Callie, to ultimately want to get on, want to get information of where Sarah is. Ultimately, to torture Noah, to ultimately tattoo him seemingly in the eye. So we eventually have it to where Callie and Curve are searching for Ash. And so we have it to where once Callie and Curve eventually find out where Sarah lives, ultimately of Callie eventually going into said apartment and ultimately finding Ash. And here is some kind of really fun aspects and this and that, because Callie seems to have much more of a fighting set than anybody else really does. And so you get to kind of see some interesting aspects here where Callie is very much like trying to fight out Ash, but ultimately Ash just seems to overpower her. Ultimately, Callie is using knives to kind of slice up Ash, but ultimately, kind of a moot point when you have a person that, of course, cannot die. So, reasonably, we have it to where we replay the fact that Callie seems to be a person that mentions, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry." So, we ultimately have it to where when Ash slams Callie um, up against this wall and eventually just breaks her leg to where she's like dragging herself off, we have really like this time the crow really playing with his food before ultimately killing Callie. Which that's what I think I love the most about like Ash or the crow, is that he plays with his food before he kills it. So ultimately we have Crow having a baby head upon his arm and mentioning, "Hush, little baby, don't you cry," or no wait, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." And then ultimately he picks up Callie, and then ultimately while tossing her out a window to eventually get killed, he yells, "Daddy's gonna buy you a big black bird," and smashes her out the window and kills her off. Yeah, like I really liked this transition of us kind of like reusing a lot of these a lot of these things against these people and trying to change it to a very much Crow-ish like element. I kind of wish that they would have done that consistently to where every single one of these approaches, yeah, would have been kind of reverted back to them and this and that. So we ultimately have it to where Ash is now going, of course, for Curve. So we have it to where Curve is outside of the building on his motorcycle, just kind of like waiting for Callie to come out. So it ends up being that Curve is noticing Ash, and so starts to book it off of his motorcycle. Because ultimately, at some point before, we have it to where Curve ultimately was getting information from Judah, and ultimately he was at this seemingly very much S&M like nightclub, and so he ends up getting a drink, and the Crow ends up shooting him with a shotgun. And so now, otherwise, when Ash is seeing, or when Curve is seeing the Crow, ultimately he realizes full well that, hey, like, this guy is a shotgun. He's there to take me down. He's there to kill me. So I'm gonna get the f out of here. So we ultimately have it to where Curve is ultimately trying to run away from the Crow, but there's nowhere really to run. Ultimately, very much writing his way out to try to find a way to get away from the Crow, but the Crow eventually appears before Curve and shoots his engine, uh, pretty much stopping all of Curve's momentum, having him fly out of his vehicle. So we eventually have it to where Crow throws back into Curve space, wrong place, wrong time. And ultimately, I think before that, he ultimately throws back at him that there's nothing personal. So we have it to where, since Curve is so hurt, basically it's a simplistic notion of like, okay, well, Curve's not really going anywhere. So ultimately, the Crow ultimately mentions about how normally you would give people money right before they died, so that way they would have money to pay the toll for the Reaper to take them on to the afterlife. And so eventually we have it to where Ash tells Curve to open his mouth. Ash puts a coin into his mouth, closes it, and Curve is choking on it while being dragged into this little pond to, of course, be where Curve goes to die. Eventually being presented within a bunch of flowers around his body to present a crow-like signia. So basically now everybody is pretty much like done with, to the point of which we have Sarah, who ends up having to forcibly be with Judah. Ultimately, of course, Judah is holding this woman hostage, knowing full well how valuable the that this woman is to the Crow, because ultimately knowing full well, like, she is her, or Ash, like, they notice that how valuable Sarah is to Ash, so ultimately that's why they ended up grabbing her. So reasonably, we have it to where Judah is trying to figure out what the master plan is to ultimately take the Crow down, because it doesn't really seem like guns and or knives is going to work. So ultimately, Judah asks the fortune teller to ultimately figure out what his weakness is, and ultimately the fortune teller tells Judah that his weakness is the Crow, the Crow itself. That's what's kind of keeping him to this plane. So ultimately, while Ash is trying to figure out where Sarah is, ultimately having it to where the Crow flies within to meet Sarah, ultimately they end up grabbing the Crow and end up stabbing the wings of the Crow, and then very much trying to drain this crow's blood to ultimately transfer it into Judah, knowing full well that this is exactly where Ash gets his power from, is the Crow. So taking the blood out of the Crow, ultimately giving it to Judah, ultimately will give a transference of all of Ash's power to Judah. So now we have Judah, who is even much more confident than he ever was, and now we have Ash very much going through, noticing that a church area um, is lighting candles, ultimately to remember the dead, because ultimately this is the Day of the Dead. There's a parade going on, and otherwise, Ash is trying to figure out what all is going on. And so ultimately, the priest is mentioning to Ash how reasonably some spirits would get confused. So ultimately, he thinks by having some dead come back to life during this day, people can wear masks to scare them back into the grave, I guess. So we ultimately have it to where Ash is heading to Judah, of course, to put this last nail in the coffin. But the only problem is that Ash is powerless, and Judah, of course, is seemingly unstoppable at this point. So we have it to where Ash makes his way to Judah, and ultimately, of course, they have this fight out where, again, Ash seems that he is just going to just bulldoze his way through Judah, but really not quite going to be that way. Judah ultimately has very much makeup Ash like things on, and ultimately is very much like reflecting on the fact of how much more weaker Ash is, to the point where eventually they start fighting it out, but of course Judah overpowers Ash, pushing him very much outside to ultimately have him be hung, ultimately telling people, it's like, hey, do you guys want to see death? It's like, here he is, folks. And ultimately, while hanging the crow and whipping him, telling people, it's like, when you hurt him, does he not bleed, and this and that, and everybody like, yeah, whoa, everybody's excited bizarrely about this hanging. And so we ultimately have it to where Sarah eventually tries very much to come to Judah's evade, or the crow's evade, and so ultimately she notices how Judah is going to seemingly stab the crow and try to kill him. So Sarah, realizing how weak the crow is now, she jumps in front of, basically jumps in front of Judah's blade, ultimately to get killed. Ash, very much saddened by this death, really realizing how much more weak he is and how reasonably that he needs to have some kind of power to take down Judah, because reasonably it's going to lead to more death, it's going to lead to destruction, and ultimately it's going to lead to much more pain. So ultimately Judah grabs Ash and ultimately says that Ash has no more power, and ultimately like rendering everything moot here. And Ash of course says, it's like, well, I have power. Pain is my power. So ultimately he is looking up to the sky to ultimately mentioning to the crows to take him. So ultimately, we have this very weird Ash like scene going on where there is a bunch of crows flying through Ash, evidently, to ultimately consistently attack Judah, ultimately leaving it to where it seems that all these crows are running through Judah, ultimately to eventually take little pieces of him off to hell. So that ends up leading us to where this basically movie just ends. To where reasonably like Sarah is left to eventually die, and the crow is eventually led off to ride off into the sunset with his motorcycle, ultimately saying that this guy is basically like his journey doesn't end here. That ultimately the only thing that is ultimately going to be driving him is the spirit of his son, because ultimately when Ash was down and out, we have the spirit of his son coming to the Day of the Dead to remind him. It's like, hey dad, like come up, like come on, you can beat him, you can take him. And so ultimately the spirit of Ash's son pushes him to otherwise drive off in the sunset to find the very next villain or a way to protect people at the end of the day of innocence. So ultimately there is a whole entire thing that I basically skipped upon, which was there was like, oh, there was this one moment of Sarah at the beginning of this movie meeting this girl named Grace, and ultimately offering her a cup of coffee, and ultimately Grace ultimately mentioning, it's like, well, what do I have to do to get that cup of coffee? And Sarah kind of gives up on her and walks away. Later on in the movie, Grace was looking at a thing of drugs, and the crow ultimately takes the drugs and lights it on fire and ultimately makes it disappear. Ultimately, Grace asks like, hey, how did you do that? And he says that it was magic, and ultimately he mentions to her how like we all have a little bit of magic, and so uh, yeah, I think that's where I kind of want to leave off at. Um, just talking about that one little moment, and plus something that probably, at the end of the day, is probably like the most irrelevant part of this movie. But at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say. So the Crow Salvation, or the Crow. What do I want to say? The Crow Salvation. This is not the Crow Salvation. The Crow Salvation has Kirsten Dunst in it. So the Crow, City of Angels. Yeah, a very interesting movie, but at the end of the day, it might be irrelevant to a lot of people. So more than likely, not a lick of a soul will probably view this video, which is completely fine. But maybe in time, there's just a bunch of Crow fans out there, or interestingly enough, there might be people wanting to see this just because it's a different approach. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.